Greetings, and welcome back, gentles and ladiesmen, to another installment of the comprehensive Klonoa Marathon. I'm ExoParadigmGamer, and it's time to talk about the first of 3 Klonoa titles that were never released in North America. I am of course talking about Klonoa Moonlight Museum for the Bandai Wonderswan. Now, before I get into the game proper, I'd like to address another matter. What exactly is the Bandai Wonderswan?
Yeah, I know some of you probably already know this stuff, but let's face it, if I don't talk about the Wonderswan now, I'll likely never have another opportunity. If you'd prefer to skip ahead to the review proper, click on this annotation right here. Anyways, if you think back to my review of Super Mario Land 1 and 2, you might remember a man named Gunpei Yokoi. This legendary game designer helped to create the cross-shaped D-pad, was the creative force behind the Game & Watch and Game Boy systems, and was something of a mentor to Nintendo's Shigeru Miyamoto. As I mentioned in that video, the Game Boy was one of the first handheld systems to offer console-quality games on the go, and was ultimately more successful than its colorized competitor, the Sega Game Gear. The Game Boy had one of the longest lifespans of any handheld systems in gaming history. It launched in 1989 and the Game Boy Color wouldn't supersede it until 1998. Even then, it kept the same form factor, buttons, and that teeny tiny box-shaped screen. However, this timeline leaves out a console that debuted in between the two systems. In 1985, a Massachusetts-based company known as Reflection Technologies Incorporated debuted a monochromatic stereoscopic 3D display known as the Private Eye. While the technology was rejected by most companies for its lack of color and potential to cause motion sickness, Gunpei Yokoi saw the Private Eye as an opportunity for Nintendo to innovate and stand out from its competition. Nintendo R&D 1 and R&D 2 set to work building a new console experimenting with the technology, the VR32, while Nintendo R&D 3 was left to work on what would eventually become the Nintendo 64. Unfortunately, competition for development resources between the two projects heavily cannibalized the VR32, which Yokoi never intended to release in its final form. The resulting console, the Nintendo Virtual Boy, is one of the most infamous in video game history. I could go into detail as to why, but I think the Angry Video Game Nerds episode covers it all pretty well. Bottom line, the Virtual Boy was a global commercial flop, and it led Nintendo to prioritize color displays for their next handheld console. Unfortunately, someone had to take the blame for the Virtual Boy's failure, and since the Virtual Boy was Yokoi's brainchild, he was quietly dismissed from Nintendo. Which brings us back to the topic at hand. After leaving Nintendo, Gunpei Yokoi founded his own company, Koto Laboratory, and entered into a contract with Bandai to produce a handheld system that could compete with the Game Boy Color. The result was the Bandai Wonderswan, a swanky Japanese-only handheld with a widescreen display and a then unique ability to be played in 2 orientations. Unfortunately, the Wonderswan suffered from the same flaw as the Game & Watch, Game Boy, and Virtual Boy systems. The graphics were in black and white. As in the past, Yokoi justified the omission of color by saying the monochrome graphics extended battery life and lowered the price point. And he wasn't wrong. The Sega Game Gear was in color and required 6 AA's to last a paltry 4 hours. But by the time the Wonderswan released in 1999, the Game Boy Color had already circumvented these limitations, so this excuse didn't hold water anymore. Despite this, the Wonderswan still competed moderately well in Japan, and even enjoyed support from prominent developers such as Capcom and Squaresoft. You know Final Fantasy Dawn of Souls for the GBA? That's actually a port of a pair of remakes of the first 2 Final Fantasies that were originally released on the Wonderswan Color. And yes, the Wonderswan did see a color model in 2000, along with an LCD upgrade in 2002. Unfortunately, Gunpei Yokoi wouldn't live to see any of these releases, as he was killed in a car accident in 1997. Gunpei Yokoi, you were an inspiration to the gaming industry, and I hope you rest in peace. At any rate, Klonoa Moonlight Museum was released for the original monochrome Wonderswan in 1999. As stated earlier, this game never saw a release in the North American or PAL regions, and that's entirely because the Wonderswan itself was never released outside of Japan. The game was produced alongside Klonoa 2 Lunatea's Veil, developed by Namco and Now Productions, and supervised by series creator Hideo Yoshizawa. While the PS2 game was developed with a focus on action, Moonlight Museum zeroed in on the series' puzzle elements, a choice that makes sense given the limitations of the system. The plot, while not as cinematic as Door to Phantom Isle, does offer more than your typical handheld platformer. Set before the events of the original PS1 game, Moonlight Museum opens with Klonoa and Hupo coming across a young girl crying. She informs informs the duo that a pack of mischievous artists have divided the moon into pieces and absconded with them to the mysterious Moonlight Museum. Resolving to return the moon to its rightful place, Klonoa and Hupo enter the museum. Living there are 4 artists: Piku, a painter; Treffel, a sculptor; Koof, a comic artist; and Kaho, a photographer. Each artist has used pieces of the moon to produce a masterwork, and to get them back, Klonoa and Hupo will have to enter the works and collect the pieces one by one. Eventually, the duo learns that the museum itself is actually alive, and that it is being sustained by pieces of the moon. I'd call that a spoiler, except if you're a Westerner like me, you probably wouldn't be able to tell that by simply playing the game. As you might expect, Moonlight Museum's dialogue is all written in Japanese. Thankfully, unlike Klonoa Heroes for the GBA, not being able to read the dialogue really doesn't affect the gameplay in any substantial way. But if you're like me and love Klonoa for its storytelling, the Japanese text presents a barrier to the full experience. Thanks to the magic of the internet, however, a full translation of the game's script is available on GameFAQs. Thanks, Robo-Yo-Yo! Most of it's just your typical chit-chat between Klonoa and the artists, but when Klonoa speaks with the museum itself, it reveals its motivations for stealing the moon. The museum argues that dreams and art, both reflections of the heart, are one and the same. Because the moon illuminates on dreams, it illuminates on art as well, so infusing art with pieces of the moon will allow the art to truly shine. It's a really interesting theme and motivation, and one that will unfortunately be lost in most Western players. The plot isn't as good as the console games or even the handheld sequels for that matter, but I do at least see an effort to present something unique and interesting. My only real critique is that most of the cutscenes consist of a single static image with text scrolling under it. The story could be conveyed that much better, even if you don't read Japanese, had the game included a few extra images. Compared to Empire of Dreams and Dream Champ Tournament, which features some surprisingly dynamic cutscenes, Moonlight Museum's presentation feels somewhat bare bones in comparison. Part of that is due to system limitations, but I still feel like they could have done better. I also have a few questions to ask about plot details. What world does this take place in? Phantom Isle? And then there's the presence of Hupo, which raises several questions on its own. In Door to Phantom Isle, it's implied that he's incapable of traveling beyond his own world, but Moonlight Museum suggests that apparently he can. If so, that kind of ruins the drama of Door to Phantom Isle's ending, doesn't it? But then again, does Moonlight Museum even really take place in the same canon? Does it have any continuity with the console games? I'm willing to treat the events of Moonlight Museum as a self-contained narrative for the sake of enjoying the game, but it couldn't have been that hard to answer these basic questions. Bottom line, the story is decent, but there are plot details that aren't fleshed out, and the presentation could have been a lot more engaging. Moving on to the aesthetics, it's kind of a mixed bag. An obvious point is that the graphics are in black and white, which somewhat limits the fidelity. But seeing as the Wonderswan doesn't support color graphics to begin with, I can't really hold that against the game. Besides, it feels like they squeezed as much quality out of it as they possibly could given the limitations. The sprite work is pleasant to look at and generally well animated, and the backgrounds are interesting and feature parallax scrolling to create a sense of depth. The level types are fairly unique as well and stand out from your typical side-scroller. The character designs, when you actually get to see them, are also wacky and creative. And also, given that the game is monochromatic, I do have to give the artist credit for making use of contrast to help distinguish the background from the foreground. At the end of the day though, I do think the lack of color does hold Moonlight Museum back from reaching its full potential. As for the soundtrack, I'm sorry, but I really don't care for it at all. Chiptunes aren't my favorite stylization of video game music to begin with, but even then, I've heard some damn good 8-bit music in my time. No matter how you slice it, the music in Moonlight Museum just sucks. Technical limitations and all. I mean, just listen to this song. Now, to be fair, some songs are much better than others. The opening theme, which was later remixed for the Maze of Memories in Lunatea's Veil, is a really good track and probably the best in the game. The theme for Quiet Hometown is also a decent track, but everything else is bland, repetitive, forgettable, and just not pleasant to listen to. And once again, I feel like this holds the game back. Which brings us to the gameplay. Unlike Door to Phantomile, which was a 2.5D platforming game in the vein of Pandemonium or Kirby 64, Moonlight Museum makes the transition to a standard side-scroller. The only real difference in this regard is that Klonoa can no longer throw objects into the background and foreground. In terms of basic mechanics, it retains everything that Door to Phantomile established. Klonoa runs and jumps, picks up enemies for use as a projectile attack or to extend his jumps, and can flap his ears to extend his airtime. There are 5 standard worlds in Moonlight Museum, each containing a total of 6 visions. The objective of each vision is to collect 3 pieces of the moon and then find the exit, while fighting enemies, collecting keys, and solving puzzles along the way. Each level also includes 30 Dreamstones, and if you can collect all 180 in each world, you'll unlock a unique portrait based on that world. If you've played Dream Champ Tournament on the GBA, it's exactly like that game's Dream Gallery. Moonlight Museum is light on enemy variety. 90% of the time, you're going to be dealing with the usual moos and flying moos, with the occasional spiker or giblets to spice things up. To make up for this, the game brings in puzzle set pieces like switches and shutters, boxes that you either pick up or push, fans that send you straight up to the ceiling, and boomies, which you can use to activate switches or blast open blocks. Regarding the focus on puzzle elements, it's an appreciable change of direction to give the handheld games more meat, and something that I think the GBA sequels really expound upon. I also appreciate the addition of a retry feature that lets you restart the room if you fuck something up. In this game, however, about 80% of the puzzles are no-brainers, and don't really require that much thinking. This changes as you get into the final worlds though, and there are the occasional stumpers that will get the juices flowing. Compared to the other handheld platformers, however, Moonlight Museum is definitely the easiest game when it comes to puzzles. The level design is generally pretty good, but it can sometimes get a little too labyrinthine for my taste, especially in the Laughing Prison. In regards to difficulty, it's overall pretty tame, but there are some touches worth mentioning. One of the potential criticisms of Door to Phantomile was that it was a pretty easy game, especially since the health bar gave you 6 hits in the original and 10 hits in the remake. Moonlight Museum toughens things up by shortening the health bar to 3 hits, which will become the standard in Klonoa games for the rest of the series. While some might find this an artificial increase in difficulty, I consider it quite reasonable. Hearts are scattered around levels to replenish your health, and it's entirely possible to avoid most enemies if you're paying attention. What really helps in this regard is the camera, which generally behaves pretty well. Because the Wonderswan has a widescreen display, it's easier to keep track of enemies than it would have been had the game been released on the Game Boy Color. There are only 2 problems in this regard. One, sometimes the camera has a hard time keeping up with you, so you have to stop in place and jiggle back and forth to help it catch up. Second, every 3 or 4 levels or so, you'll play a level that turns the display sideways. This allows for levels with more vertical elements, but makes it harder to see what's to your left or right. And if you're trying to record this game like I am, it means you have to constantly stop recording so you can adjust the capture window. Kind of cool, but pretty pointless. If you're a filthy side questian like my friend Alec, who's not on the Unversed cast by the way.
Just want to remind everyone, we'll never be on this podcast.
You'll be glad to know that Moonlight Museum offers a 6th world to play after you've beaten the main game. Essentially, the artists in the museum create their most devious challenges yet, and Klonoa attempts them as a final test of wit and skill. The first few are relatively straightforward, but the last 2 are basically giant fucking mazes that take forever to beat. At the end of the day, the extra visions are good optional levels that offer a nice challenge. And because you're not required to hunt down phantom islands or Mammoth dolls to unlock them, they're accessible to every player that's interested. So, what do I think about Klonoa Moonlight Museum overall? In general, it's a decent Klonoa game, especially for the first handheld game in the series. The story is pretty unique and employs some interesting ideas, the art design and widescreen ratio help prevent possible issues with visibility, and completionists will be satisfied with going after Dreamstones or taking on the 6 extra visions. I also think that Moonlight Museum does a good job translating Klonoa's core gameplay to 2D, while also giving it a more puzzle-driven design philosophy to separate it from the console games. The surprising amount of variety and creativity in the set pieces also goes a long way in improving the overall experience. Unfortunately, I'd be lying if I said that Moonlight Museum was one of my favorite Klonoa games. The story presentation feels bare bones and not particularly compelling. The monochrome graphics, while limited by the system's hardware, would have been a lot more engaging if they were on the Wonderswan's colorized competitors, and the soundtrack is dull, repetitive, and just not nice to listen to. Couple all of that with the fact that you've got to plod through 6 samey looking visions in each of the 6 worlds without any boss fights or minigames to shake things up, and the game starts to drag by the time you get to the 3rd world. At the end of the day, I was still having fun solving puzzles and finding keys, but by the time I beat Vision X6 and finished the game 100%, I couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief, you know? I don't think it helped that I beat Empire of Dreams and Dream Champ Tournament back to back before playing this game. Nevertheless, I still think that the GBA sequels are considerably better, if only for the color graphics and improved soundtracks. Klonoa Moonlight Museum is a good game, but I think that compared to all the other non-spin-off games in the series, it's probably my least favorite of the bunch. Is it worth checking out? Well, if you're a Klonoa fan and like the Game Boy Advance games, then I'd say go for it. As for everyone else, I don't think you'd be missing much if you chose to skip it. There's really nothing in Moonlight Museum gameplay-wise that you can't get from Empire of Dreams.
And that's really all I have to say. One of my shortest reviews in a very long time. But don't get too excited about that, because next time we meet, we're going to be talking about the game you've all been waiting for. That's right, folks, it's the glorious sequel to the PS1 original, Klonoa 2 Lunatea's Veil for the PlayStation 2. It's a fantastic game, and I can't wait to talk about it. Until then, I'm ExoParadigmGamer, and I hope you all enjoyed the review.
What is going on? Oh.